St. Vincent, my homeland, you gave me no mansion, no gold, no diamond, yet I love you a million for the things that you have to offer. Is more than my heart's desire. Lovely beach, tropical breeze, always there within my reach. I love you, St. Vincent, me sweet little island, St. Vincent. I love you, St. Vincent, home of the blessed St. Vincent. St. Vincent, St. Vincent, I love you. Can look at the sunrise, can look at the sunset. Sweet Mother Nature, such beauty, such splendor. Can live my life without fear. Freedom to go anywhere. You got love and you got peace. From La Soufrière to the Grenadines, I love you, St. Vincent, me sweet little island, St. Vincent. I love you, St. Vincent, home of the blessed St. Vincent. St. Vincent, St. Vincent, I love you. Calypso and reggae, look here, to make me jaggy. Bamboo melody, and in harmony. Night morning, Christmas and carnival. You got so much bacchanal. Wailing time is any time. And any time is wailing time. I love you, St. Vincent, me sweet little island, St. Vincent. I love you, St. Vincent, me high room, St. Vincent. St. Vincent, St. Vincent, mango guava jelly, early morning fish tea, coconut water, farina and zabuka, pilau, crayfish and kalaloo, sauce, dumpling and maniku, roast breadfruit, blackfish ribs, and much, much more deliciousness. I love you, St. Vincent, me sweet little island, St. Vincent. I love you, St. Vincent, home of the blessed St. Vincent. St. Vincent, St. Vincent, I love
freedom really is. You have said in your words, if the Son had made you free, you are free indeed. Help us therefore to understand that as free persons, we have a right to life, a right to ask questions if we do not understand what is happening, and to make right decisions in our choices. Into your hands in this meeting tonight. At the end, may we be satisfied that we are here and that we have learned something that we can put into practice and let someone who was not here to hear what has been said. Continue to bless other people. Keep us by your grace and by your power, all is said and done. And Jesus shall come to give us total freedom. May all of us who would have listened to your voice say, this is our God. We have waited for him and he will save us. And I thank you for the national prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.
Please be seated. Okay, let's stand for the national anthem. Obviously, I've forgotten how to update these things. But I'm hearing the song, so let us go. Okay, yes. I was at the opening or the graduation ceremony for the community college, and a teacher friend of mine, Pajak, passed by and he shouted me and he said, one of our friends and former teacher had died. So I said to him, Pajak, it's our time to go. And he said to me, well, it's not only our time to go. We are already in the departure lounge. We're only waiting on our call. I tell you this because I want to remember a verse that I had in me from the 70s, so I can't remember everything about it. So because I'm in the departure lounge, so you would excuse me if I can't remember the author, and I may only paraphrase it. But I believe it was Bradford who said, our origins are subdued in the blood, and it's for our poets to provoke them to speak. Oscar was more than a poet. And when many of us slumbered, when many of us nodded away, the drums of freedom kept coming from his home, on the sides of the street, from the pulpit, from the classroom, and from his pen. He never allowed us to forget this important journey. So that 184, 185, 189, depends on what you want, 34, 38 years, we gather to number these days. Psalm 90 says we must number all these. Number don't mean I'm 72. Yes, that's part of it. Or somebody else is 80 and somebody else is 59. Number means reflect. It means correct the mistakes of the past. And as far as is humanly possible, chart a new course without the errors of the past. That is why we have gathered here for this Emancipation lecture. So to begin, and I'll tell you a little bit more later, we'd have to give us the welcome remarks, Mrs. Camille Lackram, who is in charge of the UWI Global Campus. But let me not forget our manners. As I say, I'm comfortable with number in my days. Prime Minister, welcome. We should have said that earlier. Welcome, ministers of government. Welcome, other members of the parliament. I think I'm seeing the representative for East Kingston. Yes, welcome. Welcome, Brother Sir Errol, and I'm seeing Dr. Adrian Fraser, old veteran. Welcome, welcome one, welcome all. We are here for this lecture, and I'm sure we're going to have a wonderful time together. Mrs. Lackram.
What's that? Okay, thank you, Chair. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Honorable Prime Minister, Ministers of Government, Members of Parliament, old friends, old colleagues, new faces, a warm welcome. Welcome again to the Oscar Allen Memorial Emancipation Lecture, presented in collaboration with the Friends of Oscar Allen and the Diamondites. I am indeed heartened by a robust turnout, given that it is a Tuesday evening in St. Vincent. And I wish to thank you for attending and to actively encourage you to participate in the open forum, which follows immediately on the lecture. Over the years, the university has brought together intellectuals from across the region to present these lectures, and they have proven to be stimulating, impacting on our consciousness, and spurring national discourse in a positive and vigorous manner. This particular lecture was conceptualized to continue and to promote the legacy of social justice, so passionately yet humbly advocated by Mr. Allen. It is therefore fitting that our guest lecturer for this evening is Dr. Gary Denny, a delightful character from my own past, well remembered for his passionate approach to ensuring that young third formers embrace history in all its colors and with all its nuances. I will say no more, as he will be more fulsomely introduced by Mr. Jomo Thomas. The word emancipation for many of us evokes images of the freedom of slaves from the horrors of the slave trade and the brutal treatment on the various plantations. These are all well documented and do not bear repeating here. Yet emancipation is and should be so much more in today's context, given a modern set of circumstances and challenges. Bob Marley himself famously entreated us to free ourselves from mental slavery. It wasn't all about physical chains. Whilst I'm not privy to Dr. Denny's presentation tonight, the topic, emancipation still coming, means that there's still work to be done. It means there's still some form of slavery. There's still something from which we need to find freedom. I look forward with anticipation to his presentation, and I trust that we will all leave this place with a better appreciation of our role in emancipating ourselves and ultimately our modern society. Thank you and welcome again.
When I was at Teachers College, I got my exams results. And the first person I ran with the results was to Oscar. Felt good about the results, you know. So I got a couple A's and there was a A- or something like that. And I felt Oscar would feel happy for me and, you know, congratulated me. He looked at me and he said, "Is A- an A?" I said, "Yes, brother, it's an A." And as if he looked at the results and as if to say, "You're better than this." I expect him to say, "Congratulations, you've done well." But his response, from reading in his face, was to say, "You're better than this." I say that to introduce one of, I know, the persons who was close, a young lady who was quite close to him. And as much as he was an influence in my life, I believe he was also an influence in her life. And she's turning out to be a wonderful lady, a young lady that has written her first book of poetry and who takes her education very, very seriously. And I think that is what Oscar would want, because Oscar was such a simple human being. He wouldn't want us to remember this lecture as a way of glorifying him. He'd want us to use these lectures as a way of building characters, building personalities, of educating our folks in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, so that we would have a better day ahead of us. So he would not be able to hear. I hope Marcella will meet him in heaven. So we'll chat about it. So this time, Sister Marcella Dublin to give you a poem.
Good night, everyone. This piece, I have yet to give it a title, but I did it I did it using the theme tonight, all right? So here we go. We wear ancestral colors annually, some upon altered skin tone. We chant freedom in adopted tongues so eloquently. However, many turn their eyes and shrug their shoulders in the quest for reparatory justice, for liberation is yet to come. Royals of a stolen kingdom we are, living in the shadow of colonial misery, scarred by negations and misguided priorities. So many are still awaiting a leader for their better tomorrow, for liberation is yet to come. Emotions warm the atmosphere in lecture halls as we celebrate fallen warriors and our forefathers' resilience, yet our inside squabbles continue. For our liberation is yet to come. Although our chains have fallen and light now pours in us great knowledge, although our truth aligns with the stars from sacred rocks where our origin is preserved, today calls to many to be ready, for liberation is theirs to take. It is coming. Liberation is coming to those who re-educate themselves, the ones freed from the shackles of a one-sided narrative, to those who stand united, by whose hands our foes will be stricken. A remnant arises. The consciousness of many have awakened. To them and for them, liberation has come.
Thank you. Thank you. In a way, Oscar would say liberation is yet to come. But as I said, as we number these years, we look forward to chart the future, correcting the mistakes of the past, and do so without errors that in a way that is humanly possible. Humans would always make mistakes, but we could try to avoid the errors. At this time, because the head of the campus in charge told me, let us be as tight as possible with this session. Let us run it. So I'm running it. Miss Maxine Brown is the Chief Cultural Officer for St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and it's fitting that she gives us some remarks at this time.
Our Honorable Prime Minister, Dr. Ralph E. Gonsalves, Mrs. Camille Akram, Officer in Charge, UWI Global Campus, Mr. Jomo Thomas, Mr. Simeon Green, the Honorable Curtis King, Minister of Education, the Honorable Saboto Caesar, Minister of Agriculture, Friends of the Arts, Friends of Culture, Friends of the University of the West Indies, the Honorable Faith Bramble, our local historians, Dr. Adrian Fraser and Dr. Arnold Thomas. Our presenter today, Dr. Denny, Dr. Michael Gary Denny, our cultural ambassadors, teachers, good evening. I bring you greetings on behalf of the Department of Culture in the Ministry of Tourism, Civil Aviation, Sustainable Development and Culture. And I must hasten to add that it's always a pleasure collaborating with the University of the West Indies Global Campus in all educational endeavors. As we celebrate another year, another day in this, our Emancipation Month in August, or another year of being emancipated under the theme, embracing the past, forging ahead in the future. It is imperative that we as a people look back to assess from whence we came, to be better able to understand and appreciate our current situation. As we brag about being free, our freedom, being emancipated, being liberated, being unchained, having rights and privileges, being enfranchised, the question on the table is, how can we emancipate ourselves from mental slavery? The answer may be hard to find, but it is important for us to break that chain, break that bond, break the enemy within us, if we ought to become truly free. And as I wordplay with freedom, I will try as best to provide some possible solutions to free reign, F-R-E-E-D-O-M, freedom. Happiness is freedom. Freedom demands courage. Your freedom is one of your most prized possessions, so don't take it for granted. When one realizes that she or he might have lost his or her way, then the need to fight back for it. Freedom is never worth giving up. Therefore, we need to force ourselves to, in fact, we need to force ourselves, if we have to, in that, do all we can within our power, to be that change we want to see in this world, in this lifetime. We shall feel empowered, capable, and proud of ourselves as a people. So when we are deciding on the future direction for our country, let's all be adults and recognize everyone else's right to be an adult. Let's free ourselves from mental slavery and rise above all that have beset us or may have beset us. You cannot have a positive life and a negative mind. James Choslow Adams could not have said it any better, and I quote, "The greatest discovery of my generation is that man can alter his life simply by altering his attitude of mind," end of quote. We have to fight against racism, bias, and discrimination in all its forms. The bigger enemy is our state of mind. When we change the way we look at things, the way we look at things change. Freedom is everything. Freedom won't mean much if our own mind isn't free. If we cannot control our mind, then we can't expect ourselves to fully enjoy a life based on our own terms. So we don't to the R, I play with words. Once a teacher, always a teacher. Remind ourselves to recognize everyone else's rights. Not all the rights for you and none for the others. Rights and freedom should be for all groups of people. For to be free is not merely to cast off one strain, but to live in a way that respects and enhances the freedom of others. I ought to remember Nelson Mandela for that stern admonition, that wise counsel. E, enable ourselves to do more, act upon things more, invest more, volunteer more. We shall truly believe that everything that we do and everything that we meet is put on a path for a purpose. There are accidents. In fact, there are no accidents. We are all teachers if we are willing to pay attention to the lessons we learn. Trust our positive instincts and not be afraid to take risks, or wait for some miracle to come knocking at our door, or someone to give us permission, or depend on someone else's approval, or simply wait for someone else to do it. We ought to do our part now to make a difference in this world. That's freedom too. E is for everything, through our every being. In that, we shall do everything we can to enable change when it's due season. Do not be afraid to seek change, so that the lives of our people is always being improved, and we should speak up for what we care about. Stand up against discrimination in all forms. In fact, in that, do the right thing. Do the right thing, not when it feels right, but do the right thing with God's grace all of the time. In this road to freedom, we cannot call right wrong and wrong right. Wrong is wrong, and equally so, right is right. Do the right thing at all times. That's freedom too. Oh, one of the greatest crimes committed against us, against freedom, is slavery. The onus is on us as a people to seek redress for the wrongs that have been committed against us, as we simultaneously open our minds to think beyond just now. What is the message we are sending? What is the legacy we want to leave behind for our children and our children's children? The questions are numerous. M is also for Maxine. Make every effort to be free. Speak up for what you care about so that others who may be in bondage could see the light and be free, free indeed as well, through taking the necessary actions. In being free, be ethical. What's good for goose is also good for gander. Take actions on issues you care about, whether it's family, friends, or foe. That is freedom too. We have a choice to reclaim our freedom and take control of our lives. After almost 200 years, the tonight's lecture is dubbed Emancipation Still Coming. Interesting. I trust that our stalwart and seasoned historian, Dr. Denny, will either provide or provoke our thoughts a bit more as he simultaneously guides us into the right direction to be truly emancipated. As I wrap up my remarks, I will leave this quote here. Until justice is blind to color, until education is unaware of race, until opportunity is unconcerned with the color of man's skin, emancipation will be a proclamation, but not a fact. Lyndon B. Johnson could not have said it any better. In fact, unless we take the time to discern, to understand, to make that change, emancipation will just be a manifesto, an announcement, a statement of belief. Let's become a force to be reckoned with and make that true change in being truly emancipated. Emancipation for me, emancipation for you, emancipation for all of we. When will we all be free? I reiterate, into this lecture, in this evening's presentation, I hope you can get some more facts on how to be truly free and be free indeed. Let's labor for freedom. For everything that is really true and great and inspiring is created by the individual who can labor in freedom. It is our duty as a people to fight for freedom. I repeat, it is our duty as a people to fight for freedom. And the freedom we can most control is the freedom within ourselves.
Shake a leg now. Ministry of Culture. The cultural item from Vinci Dance Ensemble. And the piece is called Are We Folk? Are We Folk? I guess it's African dance, so it had to be a little bit more than shaking a leg. At this time, we call in on Mr. Jomo Thomas, former speaker, a friend of Oscar, and political and social activist, to introduce our speaker for us. Brother Jomo.
Thank you. Good evening. You know, it is said that a true diplomat never adopts the protocol. But because I may well be considered the least of diplomats, I would adopt the protocol as was so ably presented by the representative from the Department of Culture. And my task, my responsibility is to introduce Brother Denny. I have known him for a long time. I have known him since we were at the Roman Catholic school. I was ahead of him, but I have known him for a long time. And I recall a few months ago, I had him on my Voices radio program. And I told my sister that I was having Michael Grubby Denny on the program. And she too went to the Roman Catholic school. And her memory of Mike was that, you mean the bright one for Denny? That was Jennifer's memory of Michael Denny. You mean the bright one? And so, yes, we are here to celebrate and to bring the bright one, Michael Denny, to the people of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And he would speak to us on the topic of tonight's celebration, which is Emancipation Still Coming. The first time I heard this idea, Emancipation Still Coming, it was from Brother Oscar Allen. He said, can't remember where we were. It might have been in one of the sessions of the People's Movement for Change. He says, emancipation ain't reached yet. Emancipation still coming. And indeed, we know that is true. A lecture, a memorial lecture, is more than an academic endeavor. Indeed, it is an intellectual affair. This is why we call on people like the bright one, Michael Denny, to present. Those of us who followed would remember that last year we had another bright one, Brother Dobrino Mad from Antigua, who is married to a Vincentian woman and proudly claims his Vincentian connection. He's married to Ingrid Williams. Many of us may know Ingrid Williams Omad, but Dobrine came last year and did an outstanding lecture on the meaning and importance of reparations. And any of us who know Oscar Allen would know that Oscar, I think I would put my glasses on because I don't want to be betrayed like I was last night. Oscar Allen wrote a profoundly simple book. It is called We Want to Be Wise. All of you should get it and read it. You see, Oscar Allen was profoundly simple. But even more than that, if you knew Oscar Allen and you knew him well, Oscar Allen was simply profound. And I encourage you to try to find out more of Oscar Allen. In many respects, Oscar Allen was the people's intellectual. In much the same way in which the brilliant Italian revolutionary philosopher and intellectual Antonio Gramsci says that in his book Hegemony, says that the people, the working people, must have, the working class needs intellectuals of its own if it is to become not only a class in itself, but a class for itself. And Oscar Allen was the kind of intellectual that Antonio Gramsci talked about. You know? But in talking about an intellectual, we may want to go to another Caribbean bright one. Self-taught. The great C.L.R. James, Trinidad. Self-taught. Didn't go to university, but was a titan of intellectual discourse. And C.L.R. James says, an intellectual is not merely someone who thinks creatively, but someone whose very form of life is mediated and activated through the temporal fold of reflective being. That was C.L.R. James. And we can go to another contemporary bright one. And now I take you to the United States. And I take you to an intellectual titan who's well in his 90s now, but he's as sharp as a tack. His name is Noam Chomsky. And Noam Chomsky said, with respect to the responsibility of intellectuals, there are still other equally disturbing questions. Intellectuals are in a position to expose the lies of government, to analyze action according to their causes and motives, and often hidden intentions. Intellectuals are accorded the leisure, the faculties, and the training to seek truth lying behind the veil of distortion and misrepresentation, ideology, and class interests, through which the events of current history are presented to us. The responsibility of the intellectual, then, are much deeper than the responsibility of the people, given the unique privilege that intellectuals enjoy. Rather profound thought. As for those of us who stood by in silence and apathy, Chomsky continues, as this catastrophe slowly took shape, on what page of history do we find our proper place? Only the most insensible can escape these questions. It is the responsibility of intellectuals to speak truth and expose lies. I wanted to bring those thoughts to you, and just before I tell you a little, to tell you about Dr. Gary Denny, the bright one, in this book called We Want to Be Wise, there's an afterword by Oscar Allen, short. And Oscar, it's called Oscar, Emancipation Still Coming. And here's Oscar in his own words. Remember, the whole region waited out. Nearly 1 million special people listened most anxiously for the midnight bell to ring. At midnight, when July 31st ran out of time, they will change. And so it was. August 1st, 1938 came with a roar. A tidal wave of joy ripped the night open. Heaven heard it and danced. The mountains shook their bam bam. The sea whispered, Amen. He was writing at the time, it was 160 years, now 189 years. 160 years ago tonight, slaves became human beings. African people walked free as British colonial slavery ended. The women said it softly at first to themselves, and then they sang it out loud. All of we are ladies now. No more massa gal for massa. No, I'm sorry. All of we are ladies now. No more nigger gal for massa. Millions had died for it. Millions more had fought for it. Millions had suffered and melted on it. Millions now would build on it. Freedom time has come. Massa they done. Thank God. This is why people who want freedom or who have been won from slavery must not forget their duty to others and to themselves. Others help us win our battles against savagery and exploitation. To forget or ignore the story is to weaken our defenses and our solidarity with others. Writing to the embattled men in Asia Minor, the embattled movement in Asia Minor, Oscar goes to the Bible, he says, Paul thundered at them, freedom is what we have. Christ has set us free. Stand as free people and do not allow yourselves to become slaves again. In those words, C.L.R. James, Noam Chomsky, and Oscar Allen, I bring you Dr. Michael Gary Denny. Dr. Denny is an associate professor of history at St. Mary's College of Maryland. He obtained his first degree at the University of the West Indies, Cave Barbados, and his PhD at the prestigious Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland. Dr. Denny has lectured at the University of the West Indies at Mona campus in Jamaica. He has also taught at Kenya College in South Africa. As a Caribbean national who has studied in the United States and has lived and taught in Africa, Dr. Denny has used his experience and expertise to help create the program in Africa and African diaspora studies at St. Mary's College. At St. Mary's College, he has also taught courses in African history, Caribbean history, and African slave systems. He is currently writing a multi-volume history of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, with volume 1 entitled Native Genocide and African Enslavement in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And this book is scheduled to be published in this year, 2023. He has written and lectured extensively on politics of debt in modern South Africa and his role as a speechwriter for Nelson Mandela. The brother has been hobnobbing in good company for a long time. His major work include Flames of Race, Ashes of Debt, Reinventing Cremation in Johannesburg, and the Standard of Dying, Race, Indigence, and the Disposal of Dead Bodies in Johannesburg. And with that, I bring to you my brother, my friend, Dr. Michael Gary Denny.
Good night, everyone. And I am pleased to accept the protocols which have been, so well laid out. I suppose I would like to correct a few things. I am not the sole author of the work on St. Vincent and the Grenadines. I have with me Dr. Clee Scott is right here, Dr. Fraser, and Dr. Thomas, they're all here. So it should be understood that that work is a collective work. It is not a single work. And I would like to correct that. I was walking on my way, coming here, thinking about freedom. And I was thinking to myself that in the instance of the British Caribbean, the Vincentian planter class, freedom has a price, 20 million pounds. In the instance, however, of the planter class in North America, freedom had no price. 700,000 persons died because they were refusing to allow the enslaved in North America to become free. And so that kind of comparison is a way for me to think about this idea of freedom, that it is not some simple, straightforward phenomena, that the meaning of freedom differs on time and place and who the persons engage in thinking about it. I was also thinking of Dr. Scott's comment in one of the sessions we were having, discussing freedom. And one of the points he made is that in 1833, months before Emancipation in 1834, there were enslaved Africans who paid for their freedom, who were not prepared to trust that the British would end slavery. And so for them, holding back this money, let's wait for 4 more months. We can't do that. We can't be sure that freedom would ever come. We got to buy it now. So for them, okay, freedom, whatever price had to be paid, they were prepared to pay. And so I say these things as a way to compel reflection as to the complexity of the idea of freedom. Okay. And more particularly, what I wanted to do tonight is to bring attention to a specific moment in the history of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, which has gone absolutely unnoticed for the vast majority of Vincentians. And that is, between 1787 and 1838, where in the normal representation of Vincentian history, we are still basically a slave society. In fact, if we want to be more tight with our timeline, if we say, okay, let's move between 1797 and 1834, clearly we have in St. Vincent the victorious British plantocracy working maximum effort to put in place a plantation slave society. And they would succeed in doing so. But to do this, they had to seize control of the Garifuna land. They had to defeat the Garifuna. In the words of Dr. Scott, we use this term quite a bit in this instance, the Garifuna had to be banished from St. Vincent. And so the question that I actually want to bring to you tonight is this: what does it mean to be a Garifuna in an enslaved society? What does it mean? Because in theory, they are supposed to be free, but they're living in a society that is a slave society. What precisely does freedom mean? Because the notion that freedom is coming, well, if you're a Garifuna between 1797 and 1834, you had freedom. Before 1797, within that space, 1797 to 1834, you lost that freedom. But not in the context of the commodification of the human body. When we, the reason why I began with the idea that if you are the planter class, 20 million pounds, that's the price. So the body is commodified. It's a commodity to be bought and sold. It is monetized. We can receive money for it. But I also contrasted that in the instance of the Americans scenario where there's no money, they're going to fight to the death. And so if you're the Guy Funa living in this space between 1797 and 1834, there is no price placed upon your body. In fact, maybe about 20 years ago, it struck me like a hammer that we had in St. Vincent people, the Guy Funa, who were never slaves. And that the normal representation of Vincentian history, that 1834 marks such a momentous occasion, which it truly does for a great number of us. But that for Guy Funa, what did it mean to be living between 1797 and 1834? What does freedom mean? And so that's what I want to speak about tonight, because I want to complicate the idea of freedom. Okay. I also want to say, up front, as a kind of fundamental proposition, that I approach the enslaved Vincentians with tremendous reverence. To me, these are our ancestors. These are the ones who gave their lives so that you and I and everyone else could be here today. And so, when I look back at the history of enslavement, even as simultaneously you recognize the evil within the system, there is no grace that is available to the planter class. But simultaneously, we have to have reverence for those, the enslaved, who gave their lives so that we could be here today. And I want to make that point, if only to insist that when we contrast where we are today, in terms of using slavery as a metaphor to make sense of our experience today, remember those who died, whose bodies were commodified, whose bodies were monetized, and who fought every single day to end that kind of and to reclaim the autonomy of their bodies. So I want to make that very, very clear. But by the same token, I want all of us here today to remember that within the space we call St. Vincent and the Grenadines, not all of us were enslaved. But slavery is not the only means through which people suffer. And I am resistant to the idea that there's some kind of hierarchy of horrors. Slavery is absolutely awful, but so too is genocide. And that is the experience of the Guy Funa. And that legacy of genocide, that is the legacy that has been ignored for a couple hundred years in St. Vincent. And when we speak about emancipation, we need to remember that there were once a people in St. Vincent who were free. And then the British and others arrived. And their suffering was immense. So I do not place one horror against another. We simply recognize them as twin evils in the history of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. In fact, it is also true that the experience of the Guy Funa and the experience of the enslaved Vincentians, that's a history that is absolutely locked, interlocked one into the other. And we may have to say more about that. But what I want to do tonight, for the time available to me, is to expose, to the degree possible, what it was like to be a Garifuna in the slave society that St. Vincent became. So let me look at my text. My text says that within the period 1797 and 1838, 2 calamities descended upon the Garifuna. The first was the erasure of their civilization from St. Vincent and the Grenadines. The Garifuna were in fact the inheritors and custodians of a habit of culture that had developed in St. Vincent and the Grenadines over 3,000 years. Almost in the blink of an eye, the British had destroyed a 3,000 years old civilization. Secondly, however, this tragedy was followed by a virtual conspiracy of silence on the impact of this civilizational collapse on the Garifuna who remained in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Militarily defeated and robbed of their lands, they were sent into internal exile to survive on small tracts of infertile land granted to them by the triumphant British government. Some, in fact, chose self-imposed internal exile by disappearing deep into the Vincentian forests, either to carry on their chaotic resistance to colonial rule from the recesses of the mountains, or to maintain the greatest physical distance between themselves and the British armed forces. But no matter where they sought solace or were forced into retreat, none of them could escape the collective and individual trauma of civilizational collapse, which brought within its wake mass impoverishment, destruction of language, a crisis of faith, and indigenous Vincentians' transformation into something less than equal citizens in the land of their birth. For the Garifuna who remained in St. Vincent and the Grenadines after 1797, there was a world before 1797 which offered them the control of their destiny, just as their forefathers had done for thousands of years. And there was the world after 1797 where they would have to engage in a sustained fight to defend their humanity against the brutal oppression directed against them by the victorious British elite. The scholarly literature is silent on the post-1797 world. However, sufficient colonial records exist from which we can break this silence and tell this story. Our band of historians, particularly Drs. Fraser's and Scott, have been just tremendous resources in getting access to some of these documents. And I have lapped them up, read them, tried to make sense of them. But, I do have to honor the tremendous research skills of Dr. Fraser and Dr. Scott in discovering some of this material, which I'm sharing with you. We are literally sharing with you for the first time something which basically you can find nowhere else, because these are records which were discovered and which is being utilized in our writing of the history of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. I should also say at this point, because, and forgive me for making this point pretty late, we could not be doing this work without the support of the government of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. That has to be acknowledged. We are engaged in this study because St. Vincent and the Grenadines have in fact recognized the value to the work that we are doing. And I give tremendous credit to the government for giving us this kind of support. Now, the colonial records therefore exist, which allow us, as I said, to break the silence and tell the story. What I also want to say, though, and this is really quite surprising to me. You know, there are some things which, there are moments which avail themselves, and you see the light where previously, you know, there might have been a bit of darkness. But I was at a conference, perhaps about 2012. It was, you know, a Gaifuna conference held across there by Pismo, and several Vincentians who were Gaifuna got up and spoke. And in speaking at the conference, you know, they produce mementos, cloth, axes, all kinds of stuff that they had kept in their possession through hundreds of years within the valley. And so, it is not simply that scholars have hidden the history of the Gaifuna. Gaifuna people themselves in St. Vincent hid that history. And we have to ask ourselves, why? The answer is clear-cut. That history was hidden because to reveal that history would have subjected them to discrimination. This discrimination began in the post-1797 period. And in fact, one of the best document we have in 1830 comes from the assembly, the Vincentian government at the time, passed an act, which, let me read it carefully. The act was called an Act for the Relief of His Majesty's Free Subjects of Color. So this sounds good. The relief of the Majesty's free subjects of color. Sounds good. And then it says, whereas by various acts of this legislature, certain restraints and disabilities are imposed upon the free persons of color in this island and its dependencies, it is hereby enacted that all acts on the free persons of color who are natives of this island and their descendants shall be and the same are hereby repealed. This is great news. They're repealing in 1830 these restraints which they had imposed upon, you know, these people of color. They would call them at the time mulattoes and so on, the mixtures between black and white. You know, we could probably wonder, what if you're not a person of color? What happens? Okay, but that would be imposing something on the act. But the act didn't stop there. The act continued. Be it further enacted that nothing in this act shall extend to any Carib or their descendants remaining on this island under the act passed on the 18th day of May, 1805. In plain language, the 1805 legislation that stripped the Gaifuna of their lands, confined them to specific areas of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, denied them equal citizenship and all the other forms of discrimination which flowed from this base law. All of these restrictions on Gaifuna freedoms remained in force against the indigenous peoples in 1830. So think of what this means. From the perspective of the planter class, we will extend some freedoms to people who are, we call them black today, they call them persons of color then. But the planter class insisted the Gaifuna, all the restraints, they will remain. And so we are confronted here with that complexity of what it means to be free. The Gaifuna are free in the sense that they cannot be bought or sold, and that is important. But simultaneously, they are confined within a legislative prison, which guaranteed that they could not enjoy equal citizenship in St. Vincent under the law. So this 1830 law essentially expanded upon a legal continuum of freedom and unfreedom, where within this continuum, white Vincentians sat at the top of those who were free, and the indigenous peoples sat on the other end of the continuum, reserved for people who were denied the full suite of benefits and privileges of freedom. You know, when I'm stepping away from my text. When I first started teaching girls' high school, 1979, the great Madam Kiza looked upon me with favor. And she gave me a job which I would not have given myself to teach at St. Vincent Girls High School. And let me acknowledge the presence of one of my former colleagues, you know, Mrs. Brown, Mrs. Dara Brown, who was simply a giant of a woman. Giant in the sense that she just had the capacity to withstand any challenge, you know, thrown at her. And I always admired her because, you know, if I can be like Miss Brown, I shall have command of my students. She surely did. So I'm glad to see you here. Okay, and I'm also glad to see Luke. You know, I should tell you, you're hearing for the first time, but I am here partially because of you. You did stop me in the road sometime when I was walking and asked me if I could give a lecture. And I always thought, okay, I want to give a lecture. I didn't think I would be giving this lecture. I had a different lecture I wanted to give, called, Carib Imperium or something like that. But it was maybe another time, and so on. But yes, but Mrs. Skiza brought me into Girls High School. And in the first year of teaching Girls High School, I taught a book called Animal Farm. Okay? And in Animal Farm, which I was reading for the first time, so, in grammar school, one of my schoolmates is here, Gil Branch. We studied Shakespeare, we studied, all kinds of stuff, but we didn't study Animal Farm. So in Animal Farm, I was on my own. And in that book, one of the stuff that struck me in Animal Farm is that the pigs who were running the farm said all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. This is what the planter class, this is the principle upon which the planter class exercised freedom in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. The Gaifuna were free, but not as free as other people. So, to protect themselves against legally sanctioned discrimination, the Gaifuna silenced themselves. That silence was in and of itself another erasure of the Gaifuna from the history of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. This legacy of Gaifuna silence across 200 years tells us that to fully explore the meaning of freedom and unfreedom in St. Vincent and the Grenadines during the era of plantation slavery, we have to unveil the experiences of the indigenous Vincentians who had to confront the twin horrors of surviving genocide and finding a place on the periphery of the Vincentian slave society. And it is perhaps the experiences of the indigenous Vincentians which underline most powerfully a central truth of Vincentian history between 1797 and 1838. The burdens of unfreedom extended far beyond the presence or the absence of a whip. If you were the enslaved, the whip was without doubt the key symbol of slavery, the key symbol of unfreedom. But what if you were Gaifuna? You're still suffering from unfreedom, even though the whip is not part of your experience. In the post-1797 moment, the cataclysmic collapse of the indigenous population was the first and most visible sign of the destruction of the indigenous civilization. No one knows with absolute precision how many Gaifuna lived in St. Vincent and the Grenadines before the British launched their series of wars. Some estimated that we had perhaps 7,000 to 8,000 persons. Others have gone higher. Say it might be 10,000. The truth is this. We have 110,000 persons in St. Vincent today, or thereabout. The carrying capacity of the land extended far beyond 10,000 persons. We know that for a fact because we're right here. And so, whether one chooses the low or the high end of these numbers, one thing is absolutely crystal clear. The Gaifuna who remained in St. Vincent after 1797 constituted a mere fraction of the population which had become demographically dominant over the last 3 decades of the 19th century. Before 1797, they were the dominant population in St. Vincent. After 1797, we got to hunt for them. Even here, the numbers are imprecise. In 1827, one author tells us that there's perhaps about 1,000 Gaifuna / Kalinago living in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. If that number is correct, it meant that they would have lost 75% of their population. Some historians indicate that the numbers were actually far worse. For example, in April 1833, we have a memo sent from a colonial official, which, let me read this memo. The memo says, quote, "Scattered over this colony in a most precarious subsistence, there are no less than 232 Caribs or Indians who since the insurrection in 1795 have continued in a state of obscurity," end of quote. 200 and something? It's a pretty important source of information because it comes from people who were there at the time, contemporaries, trying to count. So, what this memo suggests is that by 1833, the indigenous population of St. Vincent and the Grenadines was in fact on the brink of extinction. They were an endangered species. Nowhere in these documents do we detect any sympathies for the impact of this disaster. Indeed, the documents do not acknowledge that the disaster existed at all. Part of this stems from the cruelty of the times. In fact, British officials began contemplating the removal of the Gaifuna from St. Vincent as early as 1772. You know, we have been working, my fellow historians and I, on trying to complete volume 1 of the history of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And one of the key texts that informs our thinking in some of this material is a text by my former professor, Hilary Beckles. He has taught Dr. Scott as well. He has an influence on all of us in one form or another. But in chapter 2, of that book, he makes the case that we have genocide in the Windwards, and he details the collapse of these populations and so on, going back into the 1660s. And all that is true, and so on. But what is also true is that St. Vincent presents a very special case. Because in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, from 1772, we actually have the British making clear that we want to get rid of the Gaifuna in their entirety. And in the next 30 years, okay, this is precisely what they accomplished, including the mass murder that took place at Balisor. So in that sense, whereas it is correct to say that the general momentum or the general trajectory of the British and European interaction with indigenous peoples in the 17th century was genocidal in its consequences. What is certainly true that in the instance of St. Vincent, the speed at which that genocide took place was not over a couple hundred years. It took place in the space of less than 3 decades. Between 1772 and 1795, the curtain, comes down. And, that speed, we haven't, spoken about it quite a bit, but it flashed in me that it's something that when you think of Vincentian history and you want to understand the particularities of this history, what is it that makes us different, from other places, even though we're all part of the Caribbean? The speed at which the genocide took place is something we should recognize. And so, what this meant is that for those indigenous Vincentians who survived the genocide, we have a collective trauma which would have been simply unbearable. In the modern world, perhaps over the last, since Hitler decided to murder 6 million Jews, in 1939, 1945, the notion of genocide became very much a part of the, international conversations and so on. Okay, and of course we quickly discovered, well, there are other genocides as well. Okay, we can discuss why the Jewish genocide became such a central kind of motif in the international imagination of what is a genocide. But the first genocide in the modern world begins right here in the Caribbean. Okay, but it is valuable, to call upon the Jewish experience, because at least they allowed us to, to conceptualize and to look back at, for example, the case of the guy Funa. There is trauma, and it is a trauma, a historical trauma, which has never really been recognized in St. Vincent at any time. And all this is happening while they are supposedly free and living in a slave society. So you might say, okay, we have the slaves who are they enslaved, and that is, by definition, an awful condition to which any human being should have to endure. But if you are the guy Funa, you are in fact a survivor of genocide. How do we weigh these things against one another? So our only hint of the scale of this trauma visited upon the guy Funa comes through the elevation of Baliso into a monument of mourning. This is something else I want to say now. It's not in the text, but I got to make it clear now. We have nowhere in the Caribbean is there another Baliso. St. Vincent has a special place and a special obligation to secure a cemetery, a sanctuary for those who died. The guy from beyond St. Vincent and the Grenadines had never forgotten the lives which were destroyed at Baliso. It is through their memories that we have access to the grief which at the time would have overwhelmed indigenous Vincentians whose families and friends died and remained in repose at Baliso. Ironically, those who were banished from St. Vincent and the Grenadines had the freedom to grieve publicly. However, those who remained here, those left behind, had to grieve privately. They had to hide their Gaifun identity. Public knowledge of who they were brought risk. Nothing in the history of the Gaifuna, in fact, nothing in the history of humanity anywhere, could prepare people for such a trauma. It became deeply sad in the collective psyche of the Gaifuna. But Baliso also became a site of such intergenerational knowledge and intergenerational pain that even today, more than 200 years after it became the graveyard of 2,400 Gaifuna, it remains an open wound and a permanent memorial of Gaifuna grief. It's a part of Vincentian history which we should never forget. For the British, their view was pretty straightforward. The solution to Gaifuna presence in St. Vincent and the Grenadines remained: remove them all. In this, they never succeeded. The Gaifuna remaining in St. Vincent and the Grenadines relieved the extinction pressures by finding ways to escape the dragnet that had sent thousands of their friends and families into Central America. Many of these were bitter enders, warriors who chose to fight to the bitter end rather than surrender to British military supremacy. For example, one author reports that in 1801, 4 years after the formal cessation of hostilities, 6 men, 3 women, and 6 children were combatants on the run who employed commando strategies as they engaged the British in mortal combat. Anderson, a botanist, writing a history of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, a natural history of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, he speaks about the phenomena of what he called hidden Gaifuna, and tells of the discovery of a group of 2 or 3 Carib families living in the woods who finally surrendered in 1805. Other correspondence by military officials speak about finding 28 Caribs, 3 men, 13 women, and 12 children who surrendered themselves and were made prisoners. In another instance, the records point to another group of 16 men, 9 women, 20 children surrendering to the British in 1805. So in this cluster of correspondence, British officials and planters acknowledged that a number of Gaifuna had indeed evaded capture and banishment from St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Throughout these reports, 2 things stand out. First, some of the Gaifuna who escaped into the forest fought for years, even though they had no part to overcoming the militarized slave society that St. Vincent had become. They chose years of suffering and fighting against unwinnable odds before they finally surrendered to British military power. Second, however, in the wake of the expulsion of family from St. Vincent and the Grenadines, they sought to create new families molded in the polygamous culture of the Gaifuna. Ironically, their very success in producing new generations of children while they were living beyond the reach of the British Armed Forces provided the rationale for surrender. What do you do with your children when you're on the run? Do you keep fighting, or do you try to find a truce that allows your children to survive? The Gaifuna chose to allow their children to survive. It was a lack of courage. It was indeed love of children. The Gaifuna also protected their bloodlines in St. Vincent and the Grenadines by less confrontational methods. Some had in fact never formally surrendered to the British military authorities. Rather, they melted their way into the free black population and thereby eliminated the possibility of being banished from their homeland. This also gave them the extra benefit of accessing some of the rights and privileges which were given to free blacks but denied to indigenous peoples. Others, however, also melted their way into the British recognized Yellow Caribs and thereby gained legal sanctuary from deportation, even though automatically they became second-class citizens. These deliberate processes of incorporating themselves into either of these population groups reflected the Gaifuna capacity to exploit the peculiar power of genetics. In physical appearance, a Gaifuna could have the appearance of an African who had just arrived from Nigeria. Or she could look like someone who had just arrived from Venezuela. Or the person's appearance could show both African and South American biological features. In any of these cases, it afforded the Garifuna a cloak of protection that obscured their identity from their British enemies. What all of this means is that the British insistence that they knew and could distinguish a black Carib from a yellow Carib was built upon an improper understanding of the science of heredity. Indeed, by 1800, the notion that there was such a thing as a pure Indian in St. Vincent and the Grenadines lacks scientific integrity. By then, the gene flow between Africans and South American genes had been taking place for at least 250 years. But because of their physical appearance, some Garifuna people not only retained the capacity to hide within their ancestral populations from Africa or South America, they also guaranteed the propagation of Garifuna genes within the broader Vincentian population. And so we know that the Garifuna genetic line's tremendous cost, hiding their identity. Let's think of it this way. In the history of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, there's only one group of people who have had to hide their identity. I mean, Beckett sings this wonderful song, I'm an African. Okay, and of course, across the generations of, whites and Indians and all other groups have come to St. Vincent, there has generally been a recognition, a capacity to proclaim the ancestral heritage, to celebrate it. At some point, that awareness became part and parcel of the essence of what it meant to be black or white or Indian, etc. in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. But one group had to hide their identity for hundreds of years. Okay, and so I say these things, as a way that we here and now have to understand that we cannot be complicit in that kind of continuing blanket of oppression against the Garifuna people. And we do this by recognizing their place in Vincentian history and by telling that story. This is the first act of liberation, that what had been hidden becomes visible. Now, one of the most remarkable legacies of Garifuna history between 1797 and 1838 was the British fear that they constituted an ongoing threat to the colonial project, particularly, of course, the maintenance of Africans in slavery in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And this is interesting because the emergence of the Garifuna was accelerated as a new population, social category in St. Vincent and the Grenadines by enslaved Africans who escaped slavery in Barbados and arrived in St. Vincent. Now, it is true that there were other methods, other processes through which black people arrived in St. Vincent. But this transformation of Barbados into a slave society boosted the arrival of Africans in St. Vincent, and the intermarriage that then occurred allowed for the emergence of the Garifuna. So in that sense, those we have had, from at least the 1650s, what I like to call an interlocking history of black people and South American people, in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And so this fear that the British have in 1800 and 1815, that the Gaifuna may indeed encourage the enslaved in St. Vincent to rise up and join with them in that in combating slavery. The fear is real in their minds, and there's a history that demonstrates that given the opportunity, the enslaved people would rise up. And the Gaifuna demonstrated for 300 years, the Gaifuna and their predecessors, the Kalinago, their capacity and willingness to fight the British and fight Europeans for the maintenance of sovereignty in St. Vincent. So in that sense, the British fear that Gaifuna would join the enslaved to create instability on the plantations is not entirely rational. But it is also true to say that as a military threat, by after 1797, that military threat lacks the same force that it possessed before 1797. Nevertheless, we see in the official documents this continuing idea that the Gaifuna constituted a threat to the maintenance of slavery in St. Vincent. And so the British responded to that by sending military units to different parts of St. Vincent. And again, we find within some of these documents, the planters begging the British to send us more troops, because we have some Caribs in the country, and these Caribs might join up with the enslaved, and that would not be good for us. So even though they no longer represented a physical threat to the extent that they previously were, they clearly constituted a psychological threat. Now, the fear of this alliance between runaway slaves, as the British call them, or Maroons, and the Gaifuna, so deeply infected the British mind that it would find its way within British popular literature. One story entitled The Runaway Negro, a narrative of the island of St. Vincent. It's quite a fantastic story. It speaks of a runaway slave who escapes to Carib country to get beyond the reach of the enslaver. And there this runaway slave in the story met Paramount Chief Chataye, who exercised within the story unchanneled power in the Carib country. Now, in the author's belief that enslaved Africans running away to Carib country posed a threat to the security of the plantation enterprise, what this belief demonstrated is that he was very much in conversation with friends, relatives, family members who were telling him the same thing. And so that's what I mean when I said that this notion that the Gaifuna constituted a permanent threat moved from simply within the confines of British officials to the broader British public, and therefore expressed itself in some of the literature we see occurring at the time. Not good for the Gaifuna, of course, because it meant that they remained at risk of military reprisals by the British government. We should also note that the British colonial officials used the term Carib country without any sense of irony. From the perspective of the defeated Gaifuna, all of St. Vincent and the Grenadines was Carib country, from which they had been illegally dispossessed. For the colonial officials, however, Carib country simply referred to the specific lands that they had parceled out to the indigenous peoples who remained in St. Vincent after the defeat of the Gaifuna and their banishment into Central America. Most of these lands were located in the windward section of the island, including Weir, Sandy Bay, Greggs, etc. These places were beyond the plantation complex, and in the era of horseback travel, difficult to access by land. The purpose here was twofold. First, it limited the contact between enslaved Vincentians and thereby weakened the possibility of armed resistance. Secondly, it maximized the amount of land that the planters could seize for themselves, as they offered the least amount of land that they could, give out to the indigenous peoples. The transformation of the Garifuna from owners of St. Vincent and the Grenadines to a largely landless people living on the largesse of the colonial state resulted from the single greatest land theft to have ever taken place in the history of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. This was done by the British unilateral abandonment of the 1773 treaty obligations which had governed the British and the Garifuna relations up until 1795. That treaty had recognized that the vast majority of Vincentian lands in the Windward belonged to the Garifuna. However, due to their battlefield success against the Garifuna, the British announced that the Garifuna had forfeited their rights to their lands, and that the terms of the 1773 treaty were now null and void. Access to and exploitation of land was the most important source of Garifuna wealth. It became the source of British wealth, with, of course, the exploitation of tens of thousands of African bodies. Now, let me quickly say, because I'm coming to an end, that the mass immiseration, this just misery that occurred after 1797 contrasts sharply with the life of abundance that the Garifuna enjoyed before 1797. Well, there are two things actually here. In the first instance, they live a life of freedom before 1797. So, since we're speaking about, this issue of freedom, before 1797, they're free. And so, after 1797, they're supposedly still free, but utterly impoverished. And that freedom is constrained, living all kinds of, living within the boundaries set by the British. In fact, one of the ways we can understand the capacity of the Garifuna to maintain that war against the British for as long as they did is precisely because they had the resources, manpower, woman power, and food, etc., to keep that fight going on for as long as it did. And let me repeat, in the instance of the indigenous struggle here in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, it was a 300-year struggle, longer than any place else in the Americas. In fact, one of the things we discovered, I'm not sure whether it's Dr. Scott or Dr. Thomas or Dr. Fraser, it wasn't me, okay? I was the beneficiary of their work, is that in the early 1500s, we had Kalinago people heading to Puerto Rico, Jamaica, Cuba, etc., the Northern Caribbean, to fight the British. It's not the British side, the Spanish. And they were fighting the British here in St. Vincent in 1797. Vincentian warriors were there at the beginning of the struggle against European imperialists. And Vincentian warriors, 300 years later, were here at the end of the struggle. We were first in line, and we were the last to fall. I think I shall end here.
Now that you know, what are you going to do with it? Blackham warned me from the start to let us keep it as tight as possible. I didn't know how I was able to do that. Some of the speakers were very long from the beginning. But we have an open session now, and I'm going to obey what I call, I'm going to have a democratic vote now, and I'm going to obey it to the T. How much time you give yourself when we can cut this thing? Let me hear. That's the first thing. We are
9 o'clock, 10 minutes of grace. 20 minutes.
We are 17, 18 minutes to 9. I've not heard anybody saying an hour, so I'm going to take it as 35 minutes. So we go until 20 past 9. All right? We go until 20 past 9. All right? We go until 20 past 9. Prime Minister, you leaving?
I have a speech delivered on Friday in Washington. I have to write it now.
Thank you for attending, sir. All right, thank you for attending, PM. All right, good. So, first of all, let me thank you, the researchers, Scott, and who are the others? Fraser and Thomas, and you, Doctor, the bright ones, for giving us this new look of Vincentian history. I view this as a thorough case study of looking at what our colonial masters were capable of. And therefore, we are not to forget. So now that we know it, what are we going to do with it? I'm open for comments, questions, and so on. And I would also invite the other researchers, if they can add anything during the process. Let's be as sharp as possible. Yes, brother.
Yes. Well, it has been a mystery for all of these years. It's still a little mysterious to me, the kind of terms that have been used, brother, schoolmate, Denny. We hear that the Garifuna been here for 3,000 years. Then we hear Cardinal, then we hear Carol, then we hear slave. It's still a mystery to me. But somewhere in our Vincentian history, we hear of people coming from Africa in the 11th, 12th century. Africans. So who are the Garifuna? First of all, who are the Garifuna? Because that's the name that I've been hearing for most of the night.
All right. I'll take, okay, that's not yet. No, you did put up your hand.
Yeah, well, the Prime Minister left already because I wanted to say that a lot of what you're hearing is through the instrumentality of the government, and I like to give credit where it's credit. I know Vincentians like to put politics in everything. This have nothing to do with politics. And you will record me, right? Now, the question you're asking, I'm going to get to it. We now call ourselves Vincies, and we now call ourselves Vinci. And if I tell you Vincilonian, you will tell me you never heard about it. We were called Vincilonians before we were called Vincentians. Name doesn't mean anything. And all of you should know that we're all enough. What you used to call yourself during the Black Power period? What you used to call your name? You never, name never changed. Some people change the name, some people didn't change the name. Right? And I'm coming in here because it is not a fair question to Dr. Denny. He is an Africanist. He's not a Caribbeanist. I'm a Caribbeanist. Now, the first set of people here, they were called by the Europeans Arawaks and Caribs. because when the Europeans came and they met them, they were told that there were some other people and they were flesh-eating cannibals. And in the Spanish, that translated into Caribs. While the others who were more cooperative were called Arawaks. And they didn't call themselves Arawaks neither. They called themselves Tayanos or Tianos, whatever pronunciation. All right? Now, those who were called Caribs were in fact Kalinago and Kalipuna and Carifuna. And it could become very complicated because if we come to the period of enslavement, we all know about coloreds and mulatto. But if you go to Central America, every ounce of black blood you had, there was a name for you. So you might be a Quantaroon and so on. All right? Good. Now, during the period of enslavement, we know that people were coming from all over. Dr. Denny didn't pay attention to this, and this is very important. Where Garifuna came from. And there are a lot of people who go around and say things, and they are not historians. They hear things and they repeat it, and that's one of the challenge. Dr. Fraser here? Right, and Dr. Fraser will chip in a little later, and that's one of the problems we have. They were called Gariganu. Right? That's what they call themselves. But when they were banished from here and they went to Central America, they then call themselves Garifuna. So Garifuna is the name they give themselves in Central America. But in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, they were the Gariganu because they spoke the Gariganu language, which differentiate them. Dr. Denny is an Africanist, and he will perhaps want to draw a reference to Niger and Nigeria and explain that so you could understand it. Now, it doesn't matter whether you call yourself Gariganu or you call Caribs, you call Garifuna. The point is, they're all Vincies. That's what we call ourselves today, right? And we call the country Vinci. So begin to get it out of your consciousness of whether it's Garifuna, it does not matter. In fact, Dr. Denny, in the volumes we're writing, he coined a term which we have embraced. He calls them the first
Vincentians.
First Vincentians. One, just turn off his thing.
The first Vincentians.
Just tell us, because we're broadcasting, tell us who you are.
Where am I?
We're broadcasting, so that's what I'm telling you. It's going to be live. It's going to be
I'm Cleve Scott.
Good.
I'm a lecturer in history at the University of Western Cavell, and I'm actually here on official university business this week. We are doing an oral history workshop, which we are training Vincentians and persons from the other campuses how to use the methodology. Right?
Thank you. Thank you.
The first Vincentians.
First Vincentians. First Vincentian. All right, I'm recognizing Dr. Thompson, and I'm recognizing the lady in the back.
Thank you very much. I think Walford was referring to, and I don't think you, even though Cleve spoke about certain things, I'm not sure if he addressed the issue of what he was talking about in relation to persons coming over from Africa. They came before Columbus. But the question that I want to really ask is for clarification. These dueling dates, 1834 and 1838, could you please explain why in the literature it says emancipation was in 1834, but in terms of revision, we see now 1838. What really happened with respect to this issue?
Not yet, not yet. In just a time.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much. Very, very good lecture. I mean, everybody is excited. Everybody wants everything out. But let me just highlight. I asked my sister next to me, Miss Joyette, to Google when Haiti got emancipated. And it's actually today, the 22nd.
Yeah, today, the 13-year battle. And you know, I used to ask my professor at UWI as well, do you think that Chatoyer, the Garifuna, influenced Haiti? And he was like, I don't think so, but we know better right now because we know how the whole Caribbean was influenced by the Garifuna. But I just want to say, I appreciate you and what you said in terms of the first liberation is to tell the story. And I'm so glad that everyone here is listening to the story, but Dr. Cleve Scott, Dr. Fraser, you know, Dr. Adams did a tremendous amount of work as well. So I just want to say I am grateful for your information, and basically that's it. Today's the day, the Haiti, and we need to celebrate that. Thank you.
Hold on, Doc. Dr. Fraser.
Dr. Denny, I just wanted to make a couple points about the issue of numbers who remained in St. Vincent, because one of the things which frustrated the colonial office is that they were getting different numbers from the lieutenant governors and governors in St. Vincent. And they said that they wanted real numbers until at one particular time, one of them said, there are many more than we actually thought. Because a lot of these people never surrendered. They went into the interior and remained in the interior until emancipation. The other thing about numbers too is that some of the Garifuna people were able to live on in the areas where they lived before, providing they supplied the planters, they aided the planters in shipping or in transporting the sugar, particularly in the area from Grand Sable or from Georgetown. So you had a number of them who, that was their particular job. And then the other issue, and this came up to the 1830s, we had quite a number of them applying for Crown lands. And I've seen at least about 6 or 7 petitions where the Garifuna people wanted Crown lands. They were all rejected on the basis that if they gave them lands, more lands in the interior, they are going to be removed from civilization, that is from the planter civilization. So I just wanted to make those in terms of numbers. And the other point is, today we speak about Garifuna, and you made the point that they were really one people. But in that whole process, we are forgetting that the people who led the struggle were the Kalinagos. They led the struggle up until the 18th century. And I know that when the term Garifuna and Kalinago became used in St. Vincent, it created a lot of conflict in what we call the Carib communities now, because people were looking at themselves, what color, and suggesting that they were Kalinago and not Garifuna. So there, and the other issue which I wouldn't want us to go into, but people bring this up all the time, that they were here before Columbus, which is, Van Sotima's idea. And I felt that the Africans had the capacity to come to the Americas, and they were probably here before Columbus. But when you look at St. Vincent, there was no way there were black people in St. Vincent before. The earliest black person in St. Vincent was in 1646. So there are quite a number of issues which have not been tackled. But the question of the Garifuna and Kalinago is one I want to emphasize, that they were one people, whether you call them Kalinago or Garifuna. And Garifuna, we are calling them simply because of the existence of the communities of Garifuna in Central America, but they were actually one people. So I just wanted to add that, especially the issue of numbers, because there were many more of them in St. Vincent. Greg's, for instance, they said that many of them were in Greg's and they stayed in Greg's there for quite a long time. So I just wanted to add that to what you had said before in terms of numbers. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fraser. Let's go to the question from the natural natural science student. Social scientists would know the answer already. But you need to answer that one before I go to the minister. 1834, 1838, what's the difference?
Well, it's two different dates. And
$33, $34, and $38.
I think what
Yes, good night, everyone. No, I was just thinking that Dr. Thompson was being very serious when he asked about the two dates. I think it's a little misunderstanding in the sense that we talk about 1834 as being when slavery itself was abolished, when the law was passed to abolish slavery, and 1838 when the enslaved were actually freed, emancipated. So, right, after the apprenticeship period. So it's not that there was a revision of the dates, but they represented two different things, even though they pointed to eventual freedom. Okay?
Yes.
In the text, Doctor, you would see 1839. You want to speak a bit about 1839?
Well, the answer wasn't entirely as flippant as it might have sounded. That they're two different dates. You know, historians are concerned about dates. You know, and the reason for that is that different things happen. In the instance of 1834, we have, 1st August 1834. If it's July the 31st, 1834, every person who's enslaved is in fact a commodity to be bought and sold. On 1st August 1834, you no longer are a commodity to be bought and sold. You are legally in control of your body, absent the 40 hours that you gotta give to, So it's in other words, something very, very important occurred in 1834. It's 1st August 1834. That these are, on that day, the principle that enslavements, that Vincentians were commodities to be bought and sold, that principle is destroyed. Doesn't exist anymore. Okay. Now, 1838 is a different phenomena because between 1834 and 1838, what we had is, as correctly pointed out, this notion of apprenticeship, where labor was commanded. 6 to 6, commanded. What 40 hours a week or something? It was commanded. That's the hope. It was commanded. They couldn't freely of their own choose not to give that. It was commanded. Okay, so it means that when I speak of freedom being constrained, that's a constraint. So yes, they do have protection from being bought and sold, but until the 1st of August 1838, they were commanded to give labor. And so we have to recognize these as important historical, markers. Okay, so two different dates, two different set of historical realities. And so I really wanted to make that clear.
Yes. Thank you very much, Saboto Caesar, Diamond Village. I want to make a comment, really a question, and it has to do with the issue. First of all, I want to thank you and to congratulate you on an excellent presentation, and particularly so. Most persons would have gone on to do a lecture on emancipation, and that is where I was looking and angling to collect the ball,
but you stayed within a very peculiar period that's not mentioned by most. I want to underscore that Joseph Chatouet and all of his work is not really given the proper place in history as it should be. And this is not to belittle the work of Toussaint Louverture in the revolution in Haiti and Dessalines and Christophe and the work that they did. But historians have spent a lot of time studying more of the revolution in Haiti than what took place in St. Vincent and the Grenadines as a part of resistance and revolt that shaped the Caribbean civilization. And I think if you put that in the context of what was taking place in 1776, the American War of Independence, 1789, with the revolution in France, that when you look at the dates, that Joseph Chatouet and the Garifuna people in St. Vincent and the Grenadines were up front and personal in revolt and resistance. When you look at the CXC textbooks, we speak about the Bourbis Rebellion, the persons who even did work with the revolts in Barbados, and we speak about the Maroons in Jamaica, but not really the Garifuna. I want to close on this point though. It was not until I was totally immersed in a Garifuna community when I visited Dangriga in Belize did I really have a full appreciation, and there's a book, Garifuna Across Borders, which speaks about the journey when they left or moved from St. Vincent and the Grenadines and what they took with them. And there's a lot of history that was recorded, and as Dr. Fraser noted, I looked at the Garifuna map that they have in Dangriga, and Greg's is actually noted on the map, Rose Hall, and different areas where they basically had to flee to. And up to today, there are still some persons who will tell you that there are still elements of resistance in some communities around St. Vincent and the Grenadines, which you spoke about, which existed and was a threat to the colonial power. So again, thanks to you, and I think you are on to something really good with the rest of the team, and I would really like to see in our schools that Garifuna element of our history, whilst we spend time speaking about what took place in the other countries, I believe we have one of the richest pieces of history right here in St. Vincent and the Grenadines.
Good night. My name is Kirk Da Silva. I am concerned, though, I heard the minister mention it, but I'm very concerned that in some of our secondary schools, West Indian history are not being taught at the CSEC level. And I think that there's need for some concern there. I see this in light that I was speaking to a group of young people, graduates, some of them of the University of the West Indies, and I was speaking about Dr. Eric Williams. And one of the graduates of UWI turned to me and asked, Mr. Da Silva, who is Dr. Eric Williams? And I find it pathetic, if not disgraceful. I went on and I asked the group, what about Dr. Rodney? What about Maurice Bishop? What about Chedi Jagan? And some of them have never heard the names. And I think it's pertinent. I think we need to do something with the teaching of history in our secondary schools.
Now that we know, what are we going to do with it?
Good night, Mr. Denny. You're the lucky guy. You're lucky you didn't get locked up for them supposed to literature used to buy from me. I said, you might not be there. You're lucky. Now, listen to me. I want to know if there's a connection between the why the guy Funa have a holiday in Massachusetts We must question why is it that the British prefer lose the war in America. That way they take a battalion from the war to come to put the Barbarian and them under manners. So we must do some research in the connection because they have a holiday in Massachusetts for the Garifuna people. You know. But a short talk would only ask the question. We must find out that.
Thank you, thank you. Somebody else was Dr. Scott? Who is Dr. Thomas? Not here? Okay, Dr. Thomas.
I cannot be an official university business and university being accused of some things which is not true and don't think. Mr. De Silva, almost every person who study law from St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and so both of you there, you do this, they have to do a thing called Caribbean civilization, right? Including the last senator who was appointed, I taught the senator. Almost everybody in St. Vincent who doing law, I taught them, they will tell you that. And they will tell you the first thing they come to the class, the first person. No, hold on. This is a parliament, you're in the speaker, let me finish. Right? Now, we have to be careful when we hear people say things. It is not true. Every student of the university, it doesn't matter which campus, once you're not in the Faculty of Humanities, you have to do a course called Caribbean Civilization. Right? To get an exemption, you either have to have, and Curtis is here, who is a Minister of Education, he knows this. That's number one. Number two, the issue about teaching of history in schools. Most recently, Professor Alan Cobley, a professor of history, he wrote a paper for CXC, which was sent to all of the governments. And there's an organization called the Association of Caribbean Historians. We have been lobbying the governments. This have nothing to do with academics. It has to do with a lot of governments. There's some governments who have cut out history and replaced it with social studies. But you recognize globally, there's a growing consciousness of history. And that is why I standed this earlier and praise this government, because not only are we doing these volumes, we are doing also what is called a student-friendly volumes. I don't know if Dr. Denny mentioned them earlier, which are going to be used in the school system, and Curtis is here as Minister of Education. So I just want to put that in place. All those names you call, they would know them. The point about Châteauvieux and the influence on Haiti, there's a thing, again, I'm coming here because Dr. Denny is an Africanist. There's a thing called the War of Brigands, which just study Fidon in Grenada. And I mentioned Fidon too because I'm a Fidon scholar. I actually was given an award by Grenada for my work on Fidon. So you study Fidon, you study Châteauvieux, and you study Haiti, because these revolutions were inspired by the French Revolution. That is why C.L.R. James wrote the book called The Black Jacobins, because these black people had a mentality, a philosophy, which embraced this notion of equality, but because you were black, it was think that you should have it. I just want to put those, and excuse me for being excessive, because I think it's important that we don't go home without with this vacuum.
Dr. Thomas, although I know your students sometimes at the end of the thing burn the documents, you know, they get the paper and come home, still don't know Dr. Williams. So I disagree with you too. Dr. Thomas?
Sorry. What am I supposed to say?
Anything you want to say, sir?
Well, I think I'm caught by surprise. First, let me just say I am very honored to be part of this distinguished group with Dr. Denny, Dr. Scott, and Dr. Fraser. Professionally, I'm a political scientist. How did I get involved in history? In 1992, I was doing some research on Indian indentureship, and I came across, while I was at the Kew Gardens, what they call the Public Record Office in London, I came across a real heap of writings, original writings all about the indigenous people in St. Vincent. And when I read firsthand, and my comrades here know what I'm talking about, when I read firsthand the account of what happened on Baliso to what we call the Caribs, I tell you, I choked up. I really, really choked up. That was in 1992. And since then, I've been switching more to history rather than political science. And since then, I've got involved in all this history that we're talking about tonight. So, what I want to say is you're hearing some things that you have never heard before. And you still have to hear a lot more, because we are digging up some material I never knew existed. And believe you me, when a piece of information that we dig up, it has different interpretation by different people who find them. And we are given a real Vinci interpretation. When I say Vinci, I mean we are talking about the indigenous people, the Garifuna, the Kaldinago, and so on. You're going to hear, you've been hearing about it, and you're going to hear a lot more about that. Thank you.
1 minute, Dr. Fraser, before I turn over to the lecturer to conclude.
No, I just wanted to say the issue of 1834 and 1838. What should be mentioned is that in 1834, slave children under 6 were freed. Also, people who were incapacitated and old, they were freed. But the others had to go through this period of apprenticeship. And speaking about 1834, we must also mention that Antigua gained their full freedom in 1834, as was Bermuda. And I think there was another colony which I can't remember. But I just wanted to add those, because nobody had mentioned that, but some of them were freed in 1834, but children under 6. Listen here.
Minister, you're imposing, man. Come.
No, I don't think I should leave without thanking Dr. Denny for an excellent presentation, and to commend him and the other researchers in the team, Dr. Scott, Dr. Fraser, Dr. Thomas, for unearthing and presenting to us a very important period of our history, and at least speaking to the very issue of the treatment of the Garifuna people. I believe the lecture would aid generally in our understanding why it is so important for us to press forward the case for reparation. Because clearly what he spoke to is an issue of genocide, and we know when we couple that with the enslavement of Africans, I don't use the term slave, enslavement of African bodies, we have a strong case to put to our colonial, former colonial masters. Thank you very much, Dr. Den.
Yeah, Mr. Minister, I think I'd nearly forgotten that you're the Minister of Education, so you own that right. Before we go to the voter thanks from the sister, Hamilton. Okay. Short. I cut in at 20 here.
Good night, everyone. Bonsoir. I say Creole because I'm from St. Lucia. And the good professor's lecture here is a continuation of some of the stuff my uncle told me, Dr. Humphreys Regis, who specializes in African history. But I will say this: emancipation still coming, still rests on how we view our history, how we view our fellow Caribbean people if we have to be emancipated. Are we going to accept the Indians, the red-skinned ones, and I use those phrases advisedly, as one people, or are we still going to segregate ourselves from those who were born on those islands? You spoke of certain sections in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Rose Hall, Sandy Bay, Greg's, where there is still a sort of a closed society, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines not the only island. I can tell you of places in St. Lucia, even now, with all the modernized stuff available, it is still secretive. So we have a lot of work to do. Emancipation is still coming, but it all depends how we accept each other. Thank you.
Okay. Be short.
Good night, everybody. I just want to make some commentary. We're dealing with the Native American. You're dealing with name calling because the Black Caribs that come from the Amerindian and the African. Now the Black Caribs as a term is used in Latin America. And the term they use is Zombos, Z-A-M-B-O-S. Zombos in Latin America mean it's very popular in Brazil. That process going on right now in Brazil, Ecuador, Colombia, Venezuela, because black people meet the Amerindians and loving them up, so to speak. We still are name calling. The Eskimos, all we know them as the Eskimos. The Eskimos don't call themselves the Eskimos. I tell you about name calling. The Eskimos call themselves the Inuits. As other people nickname them and call them the Eskimos, which mean in a Native American language, they just eat raw meat. So name calling, well, name calling is popular with the African and the Native American. So I want to make that point, name calling.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. You see, everybody had a story to tell. I never knew that. So I need to research it. Yeah, brother. Doc, yeah, before I call for the thanks, you have 2 minutes and then call for the... After the doc, we'll hear the vote of thanks from Sister Hamilton.
It is always fun. It is always fun to attend a function like this, because I can guarantee that there will be lots of commentaries. Okay, and so the commentaries are useful because they do point to, I suppose, what we can describe as a Vincentian historical consciousness. Okay, to be interested in our history is a good starting point. Okay, now what we do with that knowledge is entirely up to us. And so, so if I'm gonna, make an ending remark, I'm gonna go back to a point I made earlier, which is the reverence that we need to attach to our enslaved ancestors. That when we look at their, at that history, we should recognize that their struggle, their resilience, all of these things, at some point, they pass down to us in one form or another. Okay, and so to the extent that we need to draw lessons as to how we live our lives today based upon the experience of the enslaved, we should not necessarily, frame this as we remain slaves, because in that sense it kind of misrepresents the situation of our enslaved ancestors. We are not in the same situation they were. That history has to be understood. That 1834 is a momentous date, even though the planter class tried everything possible to make emancipation meaningless. Yet the enslaved, the formerly enslaved, understood that this was an opening. This was even the gate opened just a little bit. Now they got to kick it down Okay, so I began here making a point that that for the planter class, slavery had a price, 20 million pounds, but for the formerly enslaved, slavery had no price. Being free was, this value in and of itself that was beyond measure. Okay, and so when we think of the means through which, or the ways through which we want to critique the modern world, using slavery as a metaphor, we always have to remember that the enslaved themselves live a life of brutality and put up struggles in ways that we don't want to repeat today. We are the beneficiaries of their work. And so what we do should be informed by their struggles, but we should be aware that nothing we say or do should belittle their work. Our lives today, for all of its impediments, it's the outcome of those men and women who died so that we could live the life we do today. Thank you so much.
Good night, everyone. Learning about our heritage is extremely important. Therefore, sessions like these are paramount in preserving our history. With that said, I would like to I am thanking Mrs. Lackram and the staff of the University of the West Indies Global Campus, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, for planning and executing this edifying lecture. Thanks to Ms. Zilpha Joyet for invoking God's presence for us. As we know, God has to be in everything that we do. Mrs. Lackram for the opening remarks. Miss Marcella Dublin, we thank you for the stimulating words of poetry. Thanks to Miss Maxine Brown for your brief remarks, and thanks to the Ministry of Culture for an excellent cultural performance that took us back to our ancestral years. Let me also express thanks to Mr. Jomo Thomas for introducing our guest speaker. Special thanks to Dr. Michael Gary Denny, our featured speaker, who eloquently delivered such knowledge about our culture and informed us that our first act of liberation is to tell the story of our Garifuna people. Thanks also to our receptive and participative audience. Thanks for attending and participating in our Oscar Allen Memorial Emancipation Lecture tonight. Have a good night.